German pilots tested a captured B-17, then admitted its 50 cals could shred anything. Part 1, December 14, 1942, Rechlin Airfield, Mecklenburg, Germany. The cold morning air carried the sound of American engines, a deep, unmistakable roar that should not have existed here, 200 miles inside the Reich. Oberstleutnant Hans-Werner Lerche stood on the frozen tarmac, watching as ground crew worked methodically around the Boeing B-17F Flying Fortress that sat incongruously among German aircraft. The red, white and blue roundels had been painted over with black crosses. The olive-drab fuselage now bore Luftwaffe markings. But the machine guns, 13 of them, remained exactly as the Americans had installed them. Lerche had test-flown nearly every aircraft type in the Luftwaffe inventory. He had evaluated captured Spitfires, analyzed Soviet fighters, examined French bombers. But this American four-engine fortress represented something fundamentally different. Not just an aircraft to understand, but a weapon system whose defensive capabilities German fighter pilots were dying to comprehend. Literally, dying. The statistics from recent combat operations told a story that made experienced commanders uneasy. Luftwaffe pilots attacking American bomber formations were being shot down at rates that exceeded anything seen over England in 1940 or 41. The B-17F before him, serial number 41-2, 4-585, had belonged to the 303rd Bombardment Group, 360th Bomb Squadron, Hell's Angels. Its original name, painted on the nose, had been Wolfhound. 2 days ago, on December 12th, this aircraft had been over France on a bombing mission. Damaged by German fighters and then savaged by a Bf-110 night fighter on its return flight, the pilot, Lieutenant Flickinger, had been forced to land at Leeuwarden Airfield in the Netherlands. The crew, expecting to become prisoners, had instead watched German technical teams arrive within hours. The bomber was too valuable to destroy, too intact to waste. Within 48 hours, after hasty repairs and the application of German national insignia, it had been flown to Rechlin under escort by 2 Bf-110 fighters. Now it sat at Erprobungsstelle Rechlin, the Reich's primary aircraft testing and evaluation center, ready to reveal its secrets. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The systematic examination of captured enemy aircraft had become a critical function of the Luftwaffe's Technical Intelligence Service. Every week, recovery teams across occupied Europe salvaged downed Allied aircraft, transported the most intact examples to testing facilities, and subjected them to exhaustive analysis. The goal was simple: understand the enemy's capabilities, identify vulnerabilities, develop counter-tactics. For fighters, this meant performance testing, maneuverability analysis, structural examination. For bombers, it meant something more urgent and more personal to every German pilot facing American formations over the Reich. It meant understanding defensive armament. The B-17 had earned its Flying Fortress nickname through more than propaganda. By late 1942, American bomber crews crossing into German airspace flew aircraft bristling with machine guns. The B-17F model carried 10.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns. Newer G models, intelligence suggested, would carry 13. These were not defensive weapons in the traditional sense, light guns meant to discourage attacks. These were offensive caliber weapons, the same M2 Browning that equipped American fighters, installed throughout the bomber's fuselage in positions designed to create overlapping fields of fire that left, in theory, no blind spots. Lerche had read the combat reports. He had attended the briefings where fighter pilots, some of the Luftwaffe's most experienced aces, described attacking American bomber formations. The descriptions were consistent and troubling. Dense defensive fire, tracers filling the air, aircraft hit from unexpected angles, fighters damaged or destroyed while attempting standard attack runs. Some pilots compared approaching a B-17 formation to flying into a cloud of steel. Others used the term the technical reports had adopted, fliegendes Stachelschwein, flying porcupine. The defensive philosophy behind the B-17's armament, represented a fundamental difference from German bomber design. Luftwaffe bombers like the He-1, 11 or Ju-88 carried machine guns, certainly, but these were secondary weapons, afterthoughts to the primary bombing mission. Protection came from speed, altitude, night operations, fighter escort. The Americans had made a different calculation. They intended to fly in daylight, in formation, without fighter escort deep into German territory. The bombers themselves had to fight their way through German fighter defences using their own firepower. This approach required not just guns, but heavy guns. The .50 caliber Browning M2 fired a 12.7mm round. In American terminology, the round was called 50 BMG, Browning machine gun. The cartridge measured 5.47 inches long and weighed 1.71 ounces. It came in several varieties: tracer rounds tipped with red paint, incendiary rounds tipped with blue, armor-piercing incendiary rounds tipped with silver, and plain armor-piercing rounds tipped with black paint. The gun itself was a masterpiece of American industrial design. The air-cooled aircraft variant, designated AN M2, weighed 61 pounds and measured 57 inches long with its 36-inch barrel. The slipstream cooling allowed a rate of fire of 750 rounds per minute. Effective range was documented at 3,500 feet, well beyond the range at which German 20mm cannon remained accurate. A fighter attacking a B-17 would be under fire before it reached optimal firing position. But statistics on paper meant little compared to actual combat performance. That was why Wolfhound had been brought to Rechlin so urgently. That was why Lerche and his technical staff would spend the next weeks conducting the most detailed examination possible of not just the bomber's flight characteristics, but its defensive weapons system. German fighter pilots needed to know: how accurate were these guns in actual combat conditions? How much ammunition did the bomber carry? How quickly could gunners engage targets? What were the actual blind spots, if any existed? And most importantly, could a German fighter survive long enough in the B-17's defensive envelope to deliver a killing strike? The evaluation would follow established protocols. First, ground examination of all weapons systems, documentation of gun positions, traverse limits, ammunition storage, fire control mechanisms. Second, static firing tests at Rechlin's weapons range to measure actual performance characteristics. Third, flight testing with the bomber's guns manned by German gunners to understand operational procedures. Fourth, mock combat scenarios with German fighters attacking the captured B-17 to identify approach angles and tactics. The data collected would be compiled into reports distributed throughout the Jagdwaffe, the fighter force defending the Reich. Lerche walked toward the bomber, noting the ground crew's careful attention to the gun positions. Wolfhound's armament represented the B-17F standard configuration. In the nose, 2.50 caliber machine guns in flexible mounts operated by the bombardier and navigator through sockets in the plexiglass. These provided forward defense but had limited fields of fire. Just behind the cockpit, the dorsal turret mounted two more .50 caliber guns in a power-operated Sperry turret. This position, operated by the flight engineer, could traverse 360 degrees and elevate to cover attacks from above and either side. In the radio compartment, a single .50 caliber gun on a flexible mount fired upward and rearward through an open hatch. Further aft, the ball turret hung beneath the fuselage, a spherical Sperry installation containing two more .50 caliber guns and a gunner crouched in an incredibly cramped position. The ball turret could rotate 360 degrees and provided the only effective defense against attacks from below. In the waist section, 2.50 caliber guns on flexible mounts, one on each side, covered beam attacks. Finally, in the tail, two more .50 caliber guns in a powered turret covered the rear. The traditional attack angle for fighter pilots, 10 guns. Approximately 6,000 rounds of ammunition distributed throughout the bomber. Multiple gunners, each responsible for their position, each with overlapping fields of fire with adjacent positions. The Germans had captured bombers before. What they had not done was systematically test the defensive capabilities in conditions that replicated actual combat. That was about to change. The technical team began with the most straightforward analysis, examining each gun position in detail. Armament specialists from Rechlin's weapons division measured traverse limits, elevation angles, depression angles. They documented how quickly each turret could rotate, how smoothly the flexible mounts tracked targets. They noted the quality of the optical sights, the ergonomics of the firing mechanisms, the accessibility of ammunition feeds. Every measurement was recorded, every mechanism photographed, every detail captured for later analysis. The ammunition examination revealed characteristics that explained much about American manufacturing philosophy. The .50 BMG rounds were manufactured to extremely tight tolerances. Primer reliability appeared excellent. The linked ammunition belts fed smoothly through the weapons. Most significantly, the variety of ammunition types indicated a sophisticated approach to air combat. Tracer rounds allowed gunners to observe their fire and adjust aim. Incendiary rounds could ignite fuel tanks or cause fires. Armor-piercing rounds could penetrate fighter cockpits or engines. The mix in combat would provide versatility against different types of attacks. The M2 Browning gun itself demonstrated American design philosophy: simple, robust, reliable. The recoil-operated mechanism was straightforward enough that field maintenance required minimal training. Parts showed interchangeability. The weapon could sustain high rates of fire without overheating, thanks to the slipstream cooling. German armament engineers, accustomed to the complexity of German aircraft weapons, found the M2's simplicity almost unsettling. This was a weapon designed for mass production, for operation by average gunners, for sustained combat use. Not a precision instrument, but a proven tool. The powered turrets represented more sophisticated technology. The Sperry turrets used in the dorsal and ball positions employed electro-hydraulic systems for traverse and elevation. The gunner controlled movements through a hand control system that allowed simultaneous rotation and elevation adjustment. The turrets could move at speeds up to 50 degrees per second, with the gunner able to track fast-moving targets with surprising accuracy. The technical team tested the turrets repeatedly, measuring response times, checking hydraulic pressures, examining the electrical systems. The engineering was sound, the construction quality high, but the most revealing tests would come at the firing range. 3 days after Wolfhound's arrival at Rechlin, the bomber was towed to the weapons testing area. Here, in controlled conditions, German gunners would fire the .50 caliber guns at stationary targets to establish baseline accuracy data. The Luftwaffe had selected experienced aerial gunners for this evaluation, men who understood defensive gunnery and could provide professional assessments of the weapon's capabilities. The first test focused on the dorsal turret. A German gunner climbed into the position, familiarized himself with the controls, loaded the ammunition belts. At ranges from 500 to 1500 meters, he fired controlled bursts at ground targets. The results were documented photographically and through direct observation. The .50 caliber rounds struck with devastating effect. At 500 meters, the grouping was tight enough to hit a fighter-sized target reliably. At 1000 meters, accuracy decreased but remained potentially lethal to an attacking aircraft. At 1500 meters, the effective limit, individual hits, would be matters of chance, but a long burst could still create a dangerous field of fire. Each gun position underwent similar testing. The waist guns demonstrated the difficulty of accurate fire from flexible mounts in slipstream conditions, but the potential for heavy volumes of fire at close range. The ball turret showed remarkable fields of fire with no blind spot directly beneath the bomber. The tail guns, perhaps most critical given the traditional rear quarter attack approach, proved capable of sustained, accurate fire at pursuing fighters. The nose guns, while limited in traverse, could at least return fire during head-on attacks. The tactic Luftwaffe fighters had recently adopted as their primary approach to bomber formations. The cumulative picture emerging from these tests troubled German analysts. The B-17's defensive armament was not a desperate collection of inadequate weapons. It was a carefully integrated system designed to create overlapping fields of fire that covered every approach angle. The .50 caliber gun was powerful enough to damage or destroy a German fighter with relatively few hits. The ammunition capacity allowed sustained defensive fire throughout an engagement. The turret systems provided rapid target acquisition and tracking. And, most significantly, when multiple B-17 seconds flew in formation, their defensive fire zones overlapped, multiplying the effective firepower exponentially. The formation tactics the Americans employed became the next subject of analysis. German intelligence had documented the evolution of American bomber formations over the preceding months. Initial raids had featured loose formations that proved vulnerable to concentrated fighter attacks. The Americans had learned quickly. By late 1942, they were flying in what they called combat box formations, tightly stacked groups of bombers arranged to maximize mutual defensive fire. A typical combat box might contain 18 to 27 bombers arranged at staggered altitudes and positions. The mathematics of this formation were stark. Each B-17F carried 10.50 caliber guns. A combat box of 18 bombers therefore presented 180 heavy machine guns to an attacking fighter. Not all guns could engage a single target simultaneously, but a fighter approaching from any angle would face fire from multiple bombers. Intelligence estimates suggested that a fighter attacking the front of a combat box formation would be targeted by 20 to 30 guns. From the sides or rear, perhaps 15 to 20 guns. Even attacks from below, traditionally the bomber's blind spot, would now face ball turret fire from multiple aircraft. German fighter pilots had adapted their tactics in response. The head-on attack, pioneered by pilots like Egon Meyer in late 1942, offered the best chance of inflicting damage while minimizing exposure to defensive fire. Approaching from 12 o'clock high, diving slightly, toward the bombers, a fighter could target the relatively less defended nose area while limiting the time spent in the defensive fire zone. But head-on attacks required exceptional skill, split-second timing, and nerves of steel. The closing speed between a fighter diving toward bombers and the bombers themselves exceeded 500 miles per hour. A pilot had perhaps 2 seconds to aim, fire, and break away before collision. Miss the shot, and the fighter had exposed itself to the bomber's guns for nothing. Hesitate on the breakaway, and collision was certain. The alternative approaches were even more dangerous. Beam attacks from the sides put the fighter in the overlapping fields of fire from dorsal turrets, waist guns, and ball turrets. Attacks from below faced ball turret fire at close range. Rear attacks, the traditional fighter approach, now meant flying directly into the tail gun's fire zone, sustaining defensive fire throughout the entire attack run. Some of the Luftwaffe's most experienced pilots had been shot down attempting rear attacks on B-17 formations. The tactical implications were profound and deeply concerning. The combination of heavy defensive armament, tight formation discipline, and increasing numbers of American bombers was creating conditions under which German fighters suffered unsustainable casualties while attempting to stop the bombing raids. Luftwaffe intelligence calculated that destroying a B-17 from the rear required approximately 20 hits from 20mm cannon shells. Given that an average German pilot achieved only about 2% hit rate in combat, this meant firing 1,020mm rounds to guarantee a bomber's destruction from that angle. A standard FW-190 fighter carried 500 rounds total. From the front, where the B-17's defensive armament was weaker, perhaps 4 or 5 well-placed 20mm shells could bring down a bomber. But the head-on attack demanded skills that only the most experienced pilots possessed. Average pilots, attacking head-on, often opened fire too early and broke away too soon, achieving little while exposing themselves to defensive fire. The mathematics were grim. More bombers arriving, each heavily armed, flying in mutually defensive formations, forcing German fighters into attack profiles where achieving decisive results required either exceptional skill or unacceptable losses. German pilots tested a captured B-17, then admitted its 50 cals could shred anything. Part 2. Lerche knew the next phase of testing would provide the most valuable intelligence. Live flight testing with German fighters making attack runs on the captured B-17. The goal was to replicate combat conditions as closely as possible without live ammunition, using gun camera footage to document what a fighter pilot would actually experience when attacking a flying fortress. The flights were scheduled for late December, contingent on weather conditions over Rechlin. The operational protocols were carefully planned. Wolfhound would fly at typical combat altitudes, around 20,000 feet, with German gunners manning all defensive positions. Bf-109 and Fo W-190 fighters would make repeated attack runs from various angles, recording their approaches with gun cameras, while the bombers' gunners tracked them with their sights, also recording the engagements. The first test flight occurred on December 23, 1942. The weather was marginal, with broken cloud cover and temperatures well below freezing, but conditions permitted safe operations. Wolfhound took off from Rechlin with a reduced fuel load and no bombs, climbing steadily to operational altitude. 4 Luftwaffe fighters followed, 2 Bf-109 Gustavs and 2 Forf-190 Anton models, all flown by experienced combat pilots familiar with bomber interception tactics. The fighters positioned themselves at varying distances and altitudes, while the dined B-17 established level flight on a predetermined course. The test protocol called for each fighter to make multiple attack runs from different angles, head-on from 12 o'clock, beam attacks from 3 and 9 o'clock, underbelly approaches from 6 o'clock low, and traditional tail attacks from 6 o'clock level. Between each pass, fighters would break away, reposition, and prepare for the next approach. Camera footage from both the fighters and the bomber positions would provide comprehensive documentation of what transpired during each attack run. After 2 hours of repeated passes, the aircraft returned to Rechlin. The film was developed immediately, and analysis began that same afternoon. The footage revealed what German fighter pilots had been reporting from combat operations, but with clarity and detail that combat reports could never capture. A head-on attack, filmed from the cockpit of a Bf-109, showed the B-17 growing larger in the gun sight. As the fighter closed to effective range, approximately 700 meters, tracers began arcing toward the camera. These were not aimed shots yet, but warning fire, letting the fighter pilot know he was entering the defensive envelope. At 500 meters, the fire intensified. The dorsal turret guns were clearly visible, tracking the fighter's approach. The nose guns joined in, their tracers crossing the fighter's flight path. By the time the fighter reached optimal firing range, around 300 to 400 meters, the screen was filled with converging tracers. The pilot broke away as practiced, pulling up and rolling to evade theoretical fire. The camera recorded the split-second window he would have had to fire his own weapons, perhaps 1.5 to 2 seconds of clear shot before mandatory breakaway to avoid collision. During those 2 seconds, he would have been under fire from at least 4 guns, possibly 6 if the ball turret had managed to elevate enough to track the target. The conclusion was stark. Head-on attacks offered the best chance to hit the bomber's vulnerable nose area, but required extraordinary skill and courage. The pilot faced 300 to 500 meters of defensive fire before reaching firing position, had 2 seconds to aim and shoot, and then had to break away immediately while still under fire. The beam attack footage showed a different problem. Approaching from 3 o'clock at bomber altitude, the W-190 fighter faced fire from the dorsal turret, the starboard waist gun, and the ball turret. The 3 gun positions could track the fighter throughout its entire approach, from initial contact at 1,000 meters through to point-blank range. The waist gun, while on a flexible mount without powered traverse, could maintain steady fire at relatively close range. The dorsal turret showed excellent tracking throughout the approach. The ball turret, able to rotate to cover the beam approach, added its 2 guns to the defensive fire. A fighter attempting a beam attack would sustain fire from multiple positions for an extended period. Unless the fighter possessed overwhelming firepower to destroy the bomber quickly, the attack profile exposed it to unacceptable risk. The tail attack footage documented why this traditional approach was becoming suicidal against B-17 formations. The camera mounted behind a fighter showed the tail turret tracking the attacking aircraft from first contact. The tail gunner had the luxury of time. The fighter was approaching directly toward his position, making range estimations straightforward and tracking relatively simple. The tail guns could fire continuously from 1,000 meters all the way to point-blank range if the fighter maintained the attack. Additionally, if other bombers were present in formation, their dorsal turrets and potentially their ball turrets could also engage a fighter attacking a neighboring bomber from the rear. The attack from below, 6 o'clock low, showed a fighter attempting to exploit what had traditionally been a bomber's blind spot. But the ball turret eliminated that blind spot. The Sperry ball turret could rotate to cover the entire lower hemisphere. A fighter approaching from below faced 2.50 caliber guns that could track it throughout the entire attack run. The footage showed the ball turret rotating to follow the fighter's approach, maintaining sight picture from initial contact through firing range. Some German pilots had reported that ball turret gunners appeared less skilled than turret gunners in other positions, perhaps because the ball turret assignment often went to the smallest crew member rather than the most skilled gunner. But even an average gunner with good visibility and clear tracking could pose a serious threat in a position with such complete fields of fire. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The technical staff at Rechlin compiled their findings into a comprehensive report designated Rechlin Test Report B-17F, classified Geheim, secret, and distributed to fighter units throughout the Luftwaffe. The report made several conclusions that would influence German fighter tactics for the remainder of the war. First, the B-17's defensive armament was substantially more effective than earlier assessments had suggested. The .50 caliber Browning M2 was a weapon fully capable of destroying German fighters, not merely damaging them. Multiple gun positions could engage a single target simultaneously, multiplying the effective firepower beyond what individual gun specifications suggested. Second, the American formation tactics created overlapping fields of fire that dramatically increased the danger to attacking fighters. A combat box formation of 18 bombers presented approximately 180 heavy machine guns with any attacking fighter, facing fire from 15 to 30 guns depending on approach angle. This concentration of defensive firepower represented a qualitative shift in bomber defensive capabilities. Third, traditional rear-quarter attacks were no longer viable against B-17 formations. The tail turrets provided effective defense, and neighboring bombers could bring additional guns to bear on fighters attacking from the rear. German fighters needed alternative attack methods. Fourth, head-on attacks offered the best balance of effectiveness and survivability, but required exceptional pilot skill. Only experienced pilots could execute head-on attacks successfully. Fifth, attacks from below remained possible, but the ball turret posed a significant threat that previous intelligence assessments had underestimated. Sixth, German fighter armament would need to be enhanced to provide enough hitting power to destroy bombers quickly during the brief firing windows available in head-on attacks. Current 20mm cannon might not provide sufficient firepower. Heavier weapons, 30mm cannon or rockets, would be necessary. The report concluded with a sobering assessment. Absent a substantial increase in German fighter strength, improved weapons, or fundamental changes in tactics, the American daylight bombing campaign could not be stopped by fighter interception alone. The B-17, and its successor models with even heavier defensive armament, represented a weapon system that balanced offensive bombing capability with defensive firepower in a manner that made individual bomber destruction extremely costly to German fighters. Only by attacking in overwhelming numbers, or by developing weapons that could destroy bombers from beyond their defensive fire range, could the Luftwaffe hope to inflict unsustainable losses on American bombing raids. German fighter units attempted to implement these lessons over the following months. The head-on attack became doctrine, taught at fighter schools and practiced by operational squadrons. Pilots learned to approach from 12 o'clock high, diving slightly, opening fire at 400 meters, and breaking away before 300 meters. Some pilots became exceptionally proficient at this technique, achieving high bomber kill counts. But the average pilot struggled with the precision timing and iron nerves required. Head-on attacks that failed to hit the bomber still exposed the fighter to defensive fire throughout the approach. Fighter losses mounted. German armament designers responded by developing heavier weapons. The 30mm Mk108 cannon was adapted for fighter installation, replacing the lighter 20mm cannon in some aircraft. The Mk108 fired explosive shells with much greater destructive power than 20mm rounds. A single hit could critically damage a bomber's engine or structure. 2 or 3 hits often proved fatal. The drawback was rate of fire and ammunition capacity. The Mk108 fired only around 600 rounds per minute compared to the 20mm rate of approximately 800. Ammunition capacity was reduced to around 60 rounds per gun compared to 250 for the 20mm cannon. Rocket weapons were also explored. The Werfer Granate 21, or WGR-21, was a 21cm air-to-air rocket derived from a ground-based Nebelwerfer rocket. Mounted on racks under fighter wings, the rockets could be launched from beyond the range of bomber defensive fire, around 1,000 meters. The rockets were unguided and relatively inaccurate, but their large warheads could destroy a bomber with a direct hit or damage it severely with a near miss. The hope was that rockets fired into bomber formations would break up the tight combat box, forcing bombers to scatter and become vulnerable to conventional fighter attacks. In practice, the rockets proved less effective than hoped. Accuracy was poor at combat ranges. Direct hits were rare. The rocket rails added drag and weight that reduced fighter performance. Most significantly, American fighters learned to attack German fighters during the vulnerable period when they were positioning for rocket launches. By early 1944, when long-range P-51 Mustang escorts began accompanying bombers deep into Germany, the rocket-armed fighters became priority targets for American escorts. The tactical situation was shifting in favor of the attackers. The Germans also explored the Sturmböcke concept, heavily armed and armored FOF W-190 variants designed specifically for bomber destruction. These Sturmbock, or battering ram, fighters carried 4 30mm cannon, or sometimes even heavier weapons. Additional armor protected the pilot and engine. The Sturmböcke were designed to penetrate directly into bomber formations, absorb defensive fire, while delivering devastating close-range attacks, and withdraw. Organized into specialized units, they would attack, as a group, accepting casualties to achieve bomber kills. The Sturmböcke proved effective when they reached bombers, but they were vulnerable to American escort fighters. The additional armor and armament made them heavy and relatively slow. In combat, they needed standard Bf-109 fighters to protect them from P-51 seconds and P-47 seconds until they could close with the bombers. This complex tactical arrangement required careful coordination and worked only when German fighters achieved numerical superiority over the American escorts. As 1944 progressed and more P-51 groups arrived in England, German fighters increasingly lost that numerical advantage. Meanwhile, the captured B-17 at Rechlin continued to serve a role beyond its initial evaluation. The bomber was designated Dornier Do 288 in Luftwaffe service, a cover designation meant to obscure its true identity. After initial testing was complete, Wolfhound was transferred to KG 200, Kampfgeschwader 200, the Luftwaffe's Special Operations Unit. KG 200 operated a diverse collection of aircraft, including captured American and British types for clandestine missions, long-range reconnaissance, and agent insertion operations. In KG 200 service, the captured B-17 seconds, eventually joined by other recovered flying fortresses, flew missions that would have seemed impossible earlier in the war. Operating in full Luftwaffe markings, the bombers conducted reconnaissance flights over Allied-controlled territory, sometimes blending with returning American formations. They dropped agents behind enemy lines in the Soviet Union and occupied territories. They conducted supply flights to isolated German units. The long range and heavy load capacity of the B-17 made it valuable for missions requiring endurance and payload that German aircraft could not match. But for training purposes, captured B-17 seconds remained at Rechlin and other evaluation centers, providing German fighter pilots with opportunities to practice attack techniques against actual flying fortresses. New pilots, transitioning to fighter units, would fly practice interceptions against the captured bomber, learning to judge closure rates, identify vulnerable areas, and understand the fields of fire from various gun positions. Combat-experienced pilots would return for refresher training, refining their techniques against a target that, unlike training slides or silhouettes, fired back. Even without live ammunition, the captured B-17's guns tracked attacking fighters, providing realistic training that no other method could match. The crews who flew the captured B-17 seconds at Rechlin developed professional respect for the aircraft itself. German pilots appreciated its stability, its system's redundancy, its ability to absorb damage and continue flying. Ground crews noted the simplicity of maintenance procedures, the interchangeability of parts, the logical layout of systems. The bomber was not sophisticated in the German engineering sense, with elegant solutions and advanced technology. It was, instead, brutally practical. Every system designed for reliability and ease of repair, every component built to tolerances that prioritized mass production over precision. The aircraft embodied American industrial philosophy: good enough, produced in quantity, maintained by average mechanics, flown by average pilots, achieving results through numbers and persistence rather than technical superiority. This realization troubled German analysts. The Luftwaffe had been built around a philosophy of quality over quantity, experienced pilots in advanced aircraft achieving air superiority through skill and technology. The Americans were demonstrating an alternative approach: adequate aircraft produced in overwhelming numbers, flown by pilots with adequate training, achieving objectives through attrition and persistence. Germany could not match American production capacity. Even if German aircraft were superior in performance, which was increasingly questionable, the numbers disparity meant the outcome was predetermined unless the Luftwaffe could achieve such favorable exchange ratios that American bomber losses became unsustainable. The B-17's defensive armament made such favorable exchange ratios impossible to achieve consistently. A German fighter attempting to destroy a B-17 faced significant risk of being shot down or damaged during the attack. Even with improved weapons and tactics, even with experienced pilots, the exchange ratio remained unfavorable. For every B-17 destroyed, the Luftwaffe lost trained pilots and irreplaceable aircraft. The Americans, with their vastly larger training pipeline and production capacity, could sustain such exchanges indefinitely. Germany could not. By mid-1943, the strategic implications of the B-17's capabilities were becoming clear to German commanders. General Adolf Galland, General der Jagdflieger, commander of the fighter forces, reported to Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring that stopping the American daylight bombing campaign would require fighter strength far beyond current or planned production. Galland calculated that matching the defensive firepower of American bomber formations would require concentrating hundreds of fighters for each major raid. Achieving the necessary numerical superiority to overcome both bomber defensive fire and American escort fighters would require even more aircraft. Germany's industrial capacity could not provide the necessary aircraft numbers. Fighter production was increasing, but not fast enough to offset combat losses. Pilot training programs were producing new pilots, but they lacked the experience necessary to execute the complex tactics required against B-17 formations. The experienced aces who could reliably destroy bombers were being lost to attrition, both from bomber defensive fire and from increasingly effective American fighter escorts. The new pilots replacing them survived, on average, less than 20 combat missions. The Luftwaffe was losing the war of attrition. The examination of the captured B-17 at Rechlin had revealed the technical details of the bomber's defensive capabilities. But the broader revelation was strategic. The Americans had created a weapon system that, deployed in sufficient numbers with adequate escort, could achieve its objectives despite German opposition. Not because the B-17 was invincible, it was not, bombers were being shot down on every mission, but because the cost of stopping the raids exceeded Germany's capacity to pay that cost. Each raid could be opposed, some bombers could be shot down. But the raids continued, and the accumulating effect was grinding down German fighter strength faster than it could be replenished. By 1944, the situation had deteriorated further. The arrival of P-51 Mustang escort fighters with sufficient range to accompany bombers to any target in Germany transformed the tactical situation entirely. German fighters now had to fight through American escorts before reaching the bombers. Once American escorts were present in strength, German fighters could no longer position for careful, coordinated attacks on bomber formations. Instead, they faced immediate combat with highly capable enemy fighters piloted by increasingly experienced American pilots. The P-51 could match or exceed the performance of any German fighter at bomber altitudes. American pilots, while not as individually experienced as remaining German aces, had the advantage of numbers and could fly aggressively, accepting casualties knowing reinforcements were available. The defensive fire from B-17 formations remained dangerous throughout 1944, even as German fighter tactics evolved. Bomber gunners, initially inexperienced, gained proficiency with operational experience. American formations tightened discipline, closing gaps that might allow German fighters to isolate individual bombers. The B-17G model, with its chin turret adding 2 more .50 caliber guns for frontal defense, reduced the effectiveness of head-on attacks. German fighters increasingly found themselves unable to reach the bombers at all, engaged in desperate combat with P-51 seconds and P-47 seconds that prevented bomber interception. The mathematical reality became inescapable. The Luftwaffe calculated that stopping a raid of 300 B-17 seconds would require destroying approximately 60 bombers, 20%, to inflict unsustainable losses that would force the Americans to cease operations. Achieving 60 bomber kills required approximately 400 fighter sorties, given average kill rates and operational factors. But 400 fighter sorties, when opposed by 200 to 300 American escort fighters, resulted in German losses that were themselves unsustainable. By late 1944, German fighter strength was declining despite increased production, because combat losses exceeded replacement rates. The captured B-17 at Rechlin had been examined, tested, understood. The reports had been distributed, tactics had been adjusted, weapons had been improved, training had been enhanced, and none of it was enough. The fundamental problem was not technical or tactical. It was strategic and industrial. The Americans could produce B-17 seconds faster than Germany could shoot them down. They could train crews faster than Germany could kill them. They could sustain losses that would have been catastrophic to the Luftwaffe, and they had escort fighters that dominated German fighters in combat over Germany itself. The crews at Rechlin continued their work, evaluating new German aircraft designs, testing improved weapons, analyzing captured Allied equipment. But the momentum of the air war had shifted irreversibly. By 1945, American and British bombers ranged across Germany almost at will. Luftwaffe fighter units were shadows of their former strength, short on aircraft, fuel, and experienced pilots. The jet fighters that promised to restore German air superiority arrived too late and in too few numbers. The war ended with hundreds of B-17 seconds flying their final missions, their defensive guns still capable of destroying any German fighter that dared approach, their crews no longer facing significant opposition from a fighter force that had been bled white in futile attempts to stop them. The story of the captured B-17 at Rechlin is ultimately a story of recognition. German pilots and engineers, some of the most skilled and knowledgeable in the world, examined the Flying Fortress and understood what they faced. They tested its guns and found them devastatingly effective. They analyzed its formation tactics and found them tactically sound. They attempted to counter its capabilities and found that success required resources Germany did not possess. They learned every technical detail about the bomber's defensive armament and discovered that knowledge alone could not change the strategic reality. The .50 caliber Browning M2 machine gun installed throughout the B-17 was not a revolutionary weapon. It was a 20-year-old design, simple and proven. But installed in numbers, in positions that provided overlapping fields of fire, in bombers that flew in mutually defensive formations, these guns created a defensive system that achieved its purpose, not by making the bomber invincible, but by making the cost of attacking the bomber too high for an opponent with limited resources and no margin for extended attrition warfare. German fighter pilots called attacking a B-17 formation like flying into a steel storm. Hans Philipp, a Luftwaffe ace with over 200 victories, including extensive combat on the Eastern Front, returned to the West to command fighter units against American bombers. He wrote to a friend, "Against 20 Russians trying to shoot you down or even 20 Spitfires, it can be exciting, even fun. But curve in towards 40 fortresses and all your past sins flash before your eyes." 4 days after writing that letter, Philipp was killed in action. He was credited with shooting down one B-17. It was also his last victory. The examination of the captured B-17 revealed more than technical data. It revealed a philosophy of war that Germany had underestimated. Not elegance, but effectiveness. Not individual superiority, but collective strength. Not decisive battles, but sustained campaigns. The Americans had built a bomber that was good enough, not perfect, but adequate to its mission when supported by the industrial capacity to produce thousands of them and the training system to crew them with adequately skilled personnel. The defensive armament was not invincible, but it was sufficient to make attacking costly enough that Germany could not sustain the effort to stop the bombing campaign. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.